And we're back. All right, Ted. We've been talking about stories with your dad, and like I said before and said a million times, he would have been the person for me to hang out with. One of the most interesting stories was your dad at 8 years old. Okay, I grew up in the city, so I had to wait till I was 17 to get my driver's license. Okay, I think there might be some places where you can get it at 14 and 15
Correct,
today.
yes.
Your dad was trying to set a new standard. How'd that story work?
Well, my father was a farm boy. He grew up on a farm, and he was the only. He had one sibling. It was a sister, and she was 3 years older than him, and so she could not handle a lot of the farm work, the heavy lifting and such. And so my grandfather employed my dad, literally. One of the things that my dad, when he first started learning how to drive, he was under the age of 8. He would drive their pickup truck through the fields while my grandfather threw bales of hay onto the back of the pickup truck. The bales of hay were too heavy for my dad, but he taught my father at least how to drive the truck. Well, eventually it turned into where my grandfather needed to have the produce on the farm go to market, and they lived outside the city of Detroit, and they lived about 20 miles outside of where they called Eastern Market, which was the farmers market in the Detroit area. And so my father would drive the pickup truck with all the produce into Detroit on a Friday night to the farmers market, sleep in the truck, and then sell whatever they had.
So he was driving at 7, 8 years old?
Yeah, so he was before 8 years old. But this story occurs right around the age of 8, where it's a Friday night, he's driving into the city. And now the reason why he was doing this was my grandfather farmed during the day, and then he worked the night shift at the Ford Rouge steel plant. So he could not do this. So my father was responsible. So you think about it, you have an 8-year-old responsible for the part of the family income. So anyway, my father's driving into the city of Detroit, and he crosses over into the boundary, and there's a police officer. And he sees my father, and he pulls him over. And he asks for his license. And my father says, I don't have a license. And the officer says, well, you can't drive in the city of Detroit without a license. And he forced my father to turn the pickup truck and turn around and go back home. Well, later that night, my grandfather gets off of work, comes home, sees the pickup truck, and he's asked my dad what's going on. My father tells him, and he says, okay, come on. He says, we got to go to the farmer's market. So he and my grandfather went there. They went to the farmer's market, sold all their produce, and my grandfather said, okay, now we're going to get you a license. So they drove to a police department.
8 years old.
8 years old. They drove to the police department, and my grandfather asked one of the officers, where do I go to get a driver's license? And they tell him, through these doors, and you'll speak to this officer. So he does so, and they go into this room, and my grandfather tells him, I need a driver's license. And the guy's like, well, just fill out this paper. He goes, well, it's for my son. And the gentleman looks at my father, realizing he's young, and says, how old is he? And my grandfather said, he's 8. He says, we've never issued a license to anybody that young. He says, we don't have a test for that. And he says, most people are adults. So they were thinking, what can we do to prove that this kid is eligible or can drive? And one police officer came up with the idea, if he could turn over the crank on their Model T Ford, they'd give him a license.
So basically the cars back in the 20s
Yes.
had a crank in front to start the car. Very difficult.
Yes. I mean, and so they all filed out of the police station, and my father says there was quite a crowd around because they were all looking to see if this 8-year-old was going to do it. And my father grabbed the crank with 2 hands, which you usually didn't do because you were always fearful of having the crank kick back at you. He grabbed it, cranked it, and he got the engine going. And the gentleman who was in charge of issuing the license said, well, if he's man enough to start a car, he's man enough to drive it. And so that's how my father got his first license.
At the age of 8.
And he drove for 88 years. We finally wrested the license away from him at 96.
Wow. These are just some of the stories that you'll see in the book, Limited Duty, which can be gotten on Amazon and Barnes & Noble?
Correct.
Cool. We'll be right back.